Let's turn now to a couple of political pros for their reaction, their insight. Mary Kate Carey joins us, former speechwriter for President George H.W. Bush, and Paul Orzulik, the former speechwriter for President Bill Clinton. And thank you both for being with us. You're both in Washington, D.C. All right, Mary Kate, first the president, was going to act, albeit reluctantly. He, stepped to the edge, about to undertake and approve a military tactical strike, and then he steps back and says, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to let Congress decide. And now, of course, there is this Russian offer. So on the one hand, initially the president is accused of indecision, vacillation, and fecklessness. And now he's accused of foreign policy by accident, an accidental diplomatic resolution, if it's sincere. So what do you make of this?
Well, from a speechwriter's point of view, Greg, this is a very difficult job. I mean, look at the changes just in the last 24 hours since the White House announced there was going to be an Oval Office address. The vote in Congress has been delayed. The UN is now involved. All the things that Peter just said is going on. I assume these poor White House speechwriters are at draft number 42. I doubt any of them got any sleep last night. I just think having an ad hoc process going on where you're supposed to be rhetorically conveying certainty and resolute actions makes it really, really hard for those speechwriters.
Paul, Bill Clinton took a completely different tact. I can think of 3 different military incursions, and he seemed to be very steadfast and decisive when he undertook them. Afghanistan, Somalia, and, of course, in the Balkans. This president, again, is being accused of utter, not indifference, but indecision and vacillation. Do you see some of that?
Well, truth, Greg, we always remember the end result of any military action. We often forget the beginning of it. And, I would actually counter with President Clinton's leadership on Kosovo, which was very similar to the way the Obama administration is suggesting we approach Syria here, which is, a limited campaign, very targeted for very specific reason.
But he went to NATO, and, he had considerable support. This president did not.
Well, I think the political jiu-jitsu here is that, on one hand, we are talking about this as a moral threat and a threat to national security, and on the other hand, we're talking about a limited strike to counter that. Now, the question becomes, are you doing this to punish the people responsible for killing 1,400 people, including 400 children with chemical weapons, or is it to prevent it from happening again? I think that we are working toward a solution right now, and I think the president tonight, it's incumbent on him from the Oval Office to talk about what are the stakes involved, including the history, what is the mission, defined very, very succinctly, what are the goals, what is the exit strategy, and what are the consequences for inaction if we don't do something here?
You know what, Mary Kate, what vexes a great many Americans is that they do realize there are excessive crimes and atrocities that occur elsewhere, and yet the United States does little or nothing. Rwanda happens to be one of them. The Congo. I mean, this stuff happens, albeit not with chemical weapons, all the time, and in greater numbers of deaths and murders. So how do you square that with the death of 1,400 people in Syria?
Well, one of the problems that the speechwriters face tonight that I think is common in any of these speeches, especially these military ones, is this is not a closed-door, Democratic fundraiser where you've got all your people in one room and you know exactly what they want to hear. Tonight, the president will be addressing multiple audiences, all with different agendas like you're talking about. Some people are, just your average American voter. You've got military people listening. You've got our allies listening. Yeah. You've got the enemy listening. And one thing that you would say to the American people, for example, saying this would be an unbelievably small strike, is not something you would want the Syrian regime to hear. Right. And so that's what you're going to with this. How do you stay consistent and yet address all these audiences at the same time? It's a really difficult job.
I would actually add to that, Greg, if I could, that to me this is what makes talk of a post-America world so naive. It's impossible to imagine China ever standing up on a moral issue facing the world and take a principled case and lead people to action. Now, this, the prohibition against chemical weapons have served and protected our troops since World War I.
Yeah.
And if in future actions, if dictators believe that they can use these without any consequences, our troops could be at risk. So, there is a case to be made that America does need to lead the moral effort against this, and that's what we're doing.
Mary Kate, even General Dempsey, in testifying recently before Congress, admitted that Bashar al-Assad has likely and will continue to likely move his assets around. It makes it very difficult for the U.S. military to achieve the kind of strike it could have had it done so earlier. Greg, right. We got an email here. Let me just read one of our email chats. It's in our chat room. Greg asked them if we are just stalling. Does Obama think that if he just draws this out, he'll be off the hook? What about that?
Well, all I know is what I know, and that is working for President Bush 41. And there was a very different scenario that I think is applicable here, which is right after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. What the order of business was, the president got the NSC lined up behind him and the Joint Chiefs. He then went to our allies. He then took them to the UN, got a UN Security Council resolution. Then he addressed a joint session of Congress and got the American people behind him, telling them all the diplomatic progress he had made. Then, when the diplomacy failed and he had to send in troops, then he asked for a vote from Congress and got it 52-47 immediately before the airstrikes began. And there was no guessing or, nobody, this sort of stuff in the last 24 hours, knowing what's going to happen.
It's apples and oranges, because you're talking about the eviction of Iraqi troops from Kuwait, which required American and coalition troops on the ground to do it. That's different than a tactical strike to take out some assets in retribution for chemical weapons usage. True.
But the point is that there was not an ad hoc process that was muddying the argument and the rhetoric. It was a very resolute series of decisions.
Let me put up on the screen a series of polls. And Chris, let's put up 1, 2, and 3 in succession, because they speak volumes about the attitude that the American public has to all of this. When asked, and this just came out yesterday evening, Fox News poll, the president's handling of Syria, look at that. I mean, 60% disapprove, a scant 29% approve. Go to the next one. Using U.S. military force in Syria to degrade the capacity, 42%. But look, 52% oppose. The next one, 61% oppose. Punishment, 61%. Helping anti-government rebels, 67%. And notwithstanding, look at that, believe that Syrian government used chemical. Yes, everybody agrees that they did. They just don't seem to be in favor of the United States getting involved. So, Paul, has the president in some ways either failed to make the case, and he's been talking about this now for the better part of 3 weeks, or is he sort of bungled it?
Well, Greg, I think we know that the Middle East has been the bane of every president's poll numbers for at least half a century now. And, the last thing the American people want is more involvement in the Middle East. It's not just Afghanistan.
So why not just leave it alone?
Long century. Well, because the United States has always had an historic role that when dictators push the line past what the world believes is acceptable, is threatens the security and the freedom of other people, the United States, unfortunately, has always been put in the position of leading the response. And in this case, it's a moral question of whether the discriminate killing of women and children with weapons that are designed to kill women and children is something that should go.
Indiscriminately all the time in other regions
they are,
of the world,
but the purpose,
in mass.
Greg,
and the Congo and Rwanda are just two examples.
The purpose of chemical weapons is to drop a bomb and have it kill as many people in that range as possible. It's the United Nations has determined more than half a century ago that chemical weapons are different. What we saw during World War I in the trenches was different.
Bullets and bombs kill as well as chemical weapons, Paul.
Sure, but the United Nations, the nations of the world through the United Nations, have cast their voice united in that this is something different. That's why we have the chemical weapons convention. It's always been different. That definition has been in place for more than half a century because the United States is now in a position of upholding that commitment of the world. Once again, the United States is in a position that we've been in the past, which is we are the leading moral voice in the world for standards. And unfortunately, presidents get put in the middle of that, and that's where we are now.
Well, we're going to see the president squarely in the middle and on television tonight in front of millions of Americans. Paul Orszalak and Mary Kate Carey, good to see you both. Thank you so much for being with us today. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.